You asked about Kidal. Most people don't. Most people who were in Mali that window know enough not to ask, or they ask about other things. The heat, the roads, whether I saw the eclipse in October. Safe questions. So when you said it, I almost didn't answer. But you were there, the same window. You know what the afternoons were like. That color, the light went around 3 o'clock, yellow, going brown, like something burning at the edge of your vision that wasn't there when you turned. You've been in that light. So I'll tell you what I haven't put in a report. I want to start earlier than the building. I want to start with September, with the first 3 weeks, because I think what happened on the 14th only makes sense if you understand what the 14th felt like from inside a body that had been in that compound for 22 days. I'd done 2 deployments before Mali, South Sudan in 2014, then the Central African Republic in 2015. By the time I got to Kidal, I had a system. You develop a system or you don't last. Not in the dramatic way, not breaking down, just the slow erosion that happens when you're 2 years into doing work that costs more than it pays back. My system was simple: eat at the same time every day, sleep when you can, don't think about Cali until you're back in Cali. The not thinking about Cali part was the system. Everything else was just maintenance. The food in the compound was standard issue: rice, tinned protein, occasionally something from the market that one of the Malian staff brought in, and that everybody ate gratefully and nobody examined too closely. I ate the same thing every morning: rice, hard-boiled egg, black coffee from the machine near the communications room that tasted like it had been brewed sometime in 2011 and kept warm since. I ate it at 0600 before anyone else was up. 18 minutes. Alone. Looking at the wall. It wasn't depression. I want to be clear about that. Depression is feeling too much of the wrong things. What I had was more like the absence of a tuning, a radio that receives the signal but doesn't convert it into sound. I was functional. I was competent. I did my job and I did it well, and I felt almost nothing doing it. I'd filed a report 14 months earlier. I'll get to the report. The point is that by September 14th, I had been in that compound for 22 days, eating the same breakfast, doing the same rounds, and the numbness had stopped feeling like a condition and started feeling like the baseline. I'd stopped expecting anything to interrupt it. That's important. You have to understand that I was not looking for something to feel. I was not primed for this. I was a medic on her 3rd deployment who had learned to keep her head down and her paperwork clean, and who was counting the weeks until rotation. That's who I was on September 14th. You want to understand the unit before I get to the building. Otherwise, the 14th doesn't make sense as a decision, and the decision is what this is really about. We had 42 personnel at the compound. Mixed. French, Ghanaian, Burkinabe, one Irish officer named Callahan who'd transferred from a different battalion and who I'd treated twice for a knee that he refused to acknowledge was structural. Callahan communicated mostly through the quality of his silences. He was one of those people who take up exactly the space they need and no more, and I respected that. He knew something had happened when I left the Central African Republic, and he didn't ask. I respected that too. The Burkinabe soldiers kept to themselves mostly, not unfriendly, just separate, which is its own kind of communication. There were two I treated regularly, Compa Aure, who had a recurring skin condition on his forearms that responded to the antifungal but kept returning, and Wedreogo, who was 23 and had decided I was someone whose advice was worth asking for, and who asked me approximately 4 questions a day, none of them medical. He wanted to know about Colombia mostly, whether it was true about the mountains, whether Cali was as hot as Ouagadougou, whether my family had always been military. On day 11, he asked whether I'd always wanted to be a doctor, and I said medic, not doctor, and he said was there a difference, and I said yes. And he waited, and I didn't explain, and he nodded as if I had. I answered what I could and deflected what I couldn't, and he accepted this as reasonable and came back the next day with more questions. On day 19, he asked what I was going to do after, and I told him I didn't know. That was the first time I'd said that out loud to anyone. He nodded again in the same way. Then he asked if Cali had good food, and I said yes, and he seemed satisfied with that and left. And then there was Asante. Kofi Asante, Ghanaian, 28, 6 deployments. Better French than half the French personnel. Better English than me, patient in the way that people who've done enough deployments are patient, not resigned, not worn down, but genuinely settled inside themselves in a way that reads as stillness. He had a habit of eating an orange every afternoon when he could get them, peeling the whole skin in one continuous strip, which he said he'd learned from his mother, who had told him patience was the only thing you could practice anywhere. He'd been unable to get oranges for 11 days by September 14th, and he was visibly, quietly annoyed about it. He mentioned it on the 13th, just once, as a statement of fact. The way you mention something that is not a complaint but deserves to be on record. That's who he was going into the building. The school was a single-story structure, pale yellow paint gone gray, courtyard enclosed on 3 sides, the eastern classroom open to the sky since 2015 when the roof came down in a weather event or an incident depending on who you asked. The courtyard sand was fine and pale, and it had blown in through the open wall and settled deep enough that you sank slightly with each step, the way you do at the edge of a beach. The resistance was patient. I noticed that on arrival and marked it and filed it and didn't know why until later. We were running a civilian relocation sweep through the northern quarter. Standard, there'd been reported activity 2 kilometers up the road, and the residents needed to move south through our position to the secondary compound. The school was on the route, and it needed to be cleared before the civilians moved through. 3 soldiers went in. Asante first, then Moreau, French, 31, a man who had decided nothing would ever genuinely surprise him, and who was usually right. Then Diaz, Chilean like me, who told me 3 days earlier that he was putting in for transfer and who I'd wished luck without meaning it particularly. I was with the vehicles, 30 meters back. I had the whole front of the building in my sight line. I was closing a minor laceration on one of the civilians, a woman in her 60s, glass cut on her palm, not serious. Working with Adora, my medic trainee, who was learning closure technique and who I was supervising without looking directly at her hands, which is how you teach it. I was half watching the building. My hands have had a tremor since the Central African Republic. Minor. It appears under stress or fatigue and disappears when I'm focused on a task. Field work keeps you focused, mostly. That morning I'd woken at 0400 with it bad enough that I'd held my right hand under my left armpit for 4 minutes before it settled, and by 600 it was manageable, and by the time we were at the school it was the background it usually was. A slight vibration. My problem. Not on any report. Moreau came out at 4 minutes. Asante came out at 6. My hands went still. Not the stillness of control, not the stillness of a focused task. The stillness of a body that has already made a decision and is waiting for the mind to catch up. I'd felt it once before in the Central African Republic, 3 seconds before a situation that could have gone badly and didn't, because I'd moved when my hands told me to. I handed the suture kit to Adewara. I told her to finish the closure. I was already moving. I crossed the 30 meters. I told Moreau to stay with the vehicles. I walked to where Asante was standing at the edge of the building's shadow. He told me Diaz was in the back classroom, that the rear wall had partially collapsed, that Diaz had signaled to the rubble he was uninjured and working around the east side. He gave me this clearly in the correct order with the right details. Except for the half second. You know how language works in the field after enough deployments. You stop thinking about switching between them. You're operating in 2 or 3 simultaneously, and the processing is invisible. Asante had 6 deployments. There was no reason for a delay between a simple question and a simple answer. In that half second, something was deciding what Asante should say. I clocked it. I kept my face still. I said good work and walked back to the vehicles and wrote down 14,047. His eyes were his. I want to say that plainly because I've said this to people who heard Ghost Story and stopped listening. Same color, same set, same everything. Nothing about his eyes had changed that I could have pointed to in a photograph. But behind them, behind the physical surface of his eyes, behind whatever layer sits behind that, something was present that hadn't been there when he went into the building. You know how you walk into a room and know someone has recently been in it, not because anything is moved, but because the air has a quality it didn't have when the room was empty? It was like that, except the room was Asante's eyes, and what had been in the room was still there. And it was attending. Not to me. This is the part I need you to understand. It wasn't interested in me. It was interested in the vehicles, the civilians, the road going north, the pattern of the unit's movement. I was the window it was looking through. What it was looking at was everything around me. I told Vautrin I needed to hold Asante for evaluation. Here's what you need to know about Vautrin before I tell you how that conversation went. 14 months before Mali, I was in a forward operating base in the Central African Republic, and a soldier under Vautrin's command came to me with injuries inconsistent with the reported mechanism. I documented this carefully. I submitted a report to Vautrin's superior officer. The report described what I'd observed, what the injuries suggested, and what I believed had occurred. The report was filed, not acted on. Filed. Vautrin was informed of the report's existence. He was not interviewed. No formal review was opened. He was assigned to Mali 4 months later. I was assigned to Mali 2 months after that, which I believe was coincidence, because the alternative is something I can't afford to spend time thinking about. He heard me out. He operated on the assumption that operational continuity was itself a moral good, and that anything which disrupts it requires a very high burden of proof. This is not an unreasonable position for someone running peacekeeping operations in northern Mali. It is also the position that makes certain things possible. He asked me what the clinical basis for the hold was. I told him anomalous response latency, inconsistent with a concussion profile in a soldier who'd been inside a compromised structure. He asked whether Asante had reported any symptoms. I said no. He asked whether the initial field screen had flagged anything. I said field screens have limits. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me in the Central African Republic when I filed the report. Not hostile, not dismissive, calculating. The calculation of a man deciding whether you are worth the friction. He gave me until 16:30, 90 minutes. I set up the evaluation in the medical tent. Blood pressure, 122/78. Normal. Pupillary response, equal, reactive, 2 millimeters, bilateral. Grip strength, equal bilaterally. Orientation, person, place, time, intact. He knew his name. He knew we were in Kidal. He knew it was September. He answered every question correctly. Then I asked him about Accra, whether he still had family there, whether he'd been back recently. Ordinary questions, the kind you ask to get a baseline on processing. He answered these too, correctly, in the right order. Except a half second came back on the third question. It was shorter than before, a fraction of what it had been outside the building. But it was there, that slight gap between stimulus and response, that sense of something deciding what he should say and how he should say it. I went through the rest of the examination. I had 30 minutes left when I finished the clinical components, so I sat across from him and I watched his eyes and I said, "Tell me what was in the back classroom." He said there was rubble from the eastern wall. He said Diaz was at the far end trying to clear a path. He said the roof section had come down cleanly, no secondary damage to the west wall. I said, "What did you see before Diaz?" The half second. Longer this time. "Nothing," he said. I wrote, "Patient continues to present anomalous response latency inconsistent with concussion profile. Recommend hold pending further evaluation." Then I put down my pen. The most useless sentence I've ever written. I wrote it because I didn't have a sentence that meant there is something in this soldier that was not in this soldier before he went into that building, and it is using him to observe this unit, and I don't have a form for that, and I don't have a way to say it that anyone with operational authority will hear. I sat with him for the remaining time. I didn't ask anything else. At one point, I offered him water, and he took it and drank it in the careful way people drink water when they're very thirsty and don't want to show it. That was him. That was Asante. The thing behind his eyes watched me notice this and went back to whatever it was doing. I walked to the north edge of the courtyard at 16:15. My feet went there. I know how that sounds. My feet had information my head hadn't processed, and they took me to the north wall, and I stood there and looked out across the open ground toward the ridge, 2 kilometers away. Basalt ridge, dark, flat, horizontal. I noted it on arrival the way you note terrain, filed it, moved on. There was a section of the ridge that hadn't been there in the morning. I'm not saying it appeared. I'm saying there was a section 80 meters wide, maybe 40 high, that had a quality the rest of the ridge didn't have. The rest was still. This section moved the way heat moves over metal in direct sun, that slight displacement of air above the surface. Except it wasn't heat. It was the section itself. and it was oriented toward the compound. I felt it in my sternum first. A low pressure, like the seconds before a storm breaks, except the sky was clear and the afternoon sun was the same yellow-brown it always was at this hour. Something enormous was attending to the compound from outside, the way the thing behind Asante's eyes was attending from inside, and the attending had a physical weight, a directionality, a pressure that told me without telling me that the unit should not move north. I stood there for 4 minutes. I counted. The tremor in my right hand was gone. Not managed. Not controlled. Gone. The vibration that had been with me since 2015 had simply stopped. My hand was still. I held it out flat in the yellow-brown light, and it didn't move, and I understood later, not then, but later, that whatever was in the ridge had a frequency, and the frequency had canceled something in me, the way two sounds at the right interval cancel each other and leave silence. My tremor was the silence left behind. The thing in the ridge was gone by day 3. The silence it left stayed. I walked back to the tent. Fatron came to the tent at 16:28. He asked whether I had clinical grounds for the hold. I said yes. He asked me to specify. I gave him the response, latency, the anomalous presentation, the protocol language. He said the standard screen had returned normal. I said the screen was designed for standard presentations. He said that was a circular answer. He was right. I told him I was invoking medical hold authority under MINUSMA Protocol 7.3. I told him the unit could not move Asante until I cleared him. I told him the unit's movement north needed to be postponed until I completed the evaluation. He looked at me for a while. The same look as the Central African Republic. The calculation of a man deciding whether you are worth the administrative friction. You filed a report 14 months ago, he said. Not a question. Yes. You're filing one now. I'm invoking a medical hold. That's different from a report. Is it? It wasn't a question either. He stood in the entrance of the medical tent with his hands at his sides, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said what we both knew, which was that the report had not been nothing. That the report had shaped everything about the two of us standing in this tent in northern Mali. That the calculation he was running was not only operational, but personal, and that personal was not a category he would ever name out loud. The unit moves at 1700, he said, with or without your clearance. He left. I sat with Asante. I didn't do anything clinical. I sat across from him and I thought about the ridge and what was in the ridge and what the unit moving north would mean. At 16:43, I said, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" The half second. "No," he said. I nodded. I stood up. I went to find Vautrin and I told him the unit should not move north. He asked why. I told him I couldn't put it in terms the report would accept. He said the unit was moving at 1700. They moved out at... The clinic is on KL5, El Peñón neighborhood. Lease in my name since February. There's a woman named Pilar who comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help with intake. The hold on Asante stood. The paperwork was correct and Vautrin wasn't going to falsify medical documentation. Asante stayed at the compound with Callahan, Compawore, Wedreogo, and the driver. The unit went north. Nothing happened. I want to say that plainly because I know how this story sounds when I'm building to something. The unit completed the relocation. They came back at 2100. No casualties. No incidents. Mission logged successful. I examined Asante twice a day for the next 4 days. Day 2, I sat across from him and asked what his mother had told him about patience besides the orange. He looked at me for a moment, the half second, then clearing, and said she'd told him that patience wasn't the same as waiting, that waiting was what you did when you had no choice, but patience was a decision you kept making. He said this in the careful way of someone repeating something they thought about many times. The thing behind his eyes attended to this statement and processed it and filed it in whatever way it filed things. I went to the north wall at 1615. The section of ridge was there, still displacing, still oriented toward the compound. Day 3 morning, the latency had reduced. Not gone, shorter. I noticed it first in the Accra questions. He answered about his sister before I'd finished asking, which was the opposite of the half second, which was its own information. Something shifting. At 1600, I went to the north wall. The section was still. Just basalt. Just the flat, dark line it had always been. The quality was gone. I stood there for 4 minutes anyway and felt nothing in my sternum. The tremor was back in my right hand, faint, familiar, doing what it always did. The silence the thing had left behind had lasted less than 24 hours. I noted this. I put my hand in my pocket and walked back. Day 4 morning, Asante was himself. I treated him for a shoulder strain in August, and I knew his baseline, the speed of his processing, the quality of his attention, the patience that was his, and not the other patients that had been using him. No latency, no gap. I asked him about the back classroom again, and he answered immediately, and the answer was different from day 1 in ways too small to put in a report and too clear to misread. In the afternoon, someone had found oranges in the market. He peeled one on the step outside the medical tent, the whole skin in one continuous strip, the way his mother had taught him. He offered me a segment. I took it. It got what it needed. Then it left. The next morning, Voltron called me into his office at 0700. He had a printed form on the desk. Medical evaluation pending, fitness for duty, administrative review. The language was correct and clean and meant exactly one thing. I signed what needed signing. I handed back my kit inventory. I was on transport out of Kidal by 1400. I didn't see Asante before I left. I cleared him that morning, fit for duty, returned to standard rotation, no further monitoring required. The paperwork was correct. I handed it to Callahan because Callahan would make sure it went where it needed to go without asking me why I was handing it to him instead of Valtrine. He took it without saying anything. One of his silences. His hand on my shoulder for 1 second. Then he walked away and I finished packing my bag. 6 months of administrative process. 3 interviews. 1 board. Separation in March. I signed the papers at a desk in Geneva. It was raining. I remember that because rain in Geneva after 6 months in Mali has a quality you can't describe to someone who hasn't felt both, like being handed something you'd forgotten existed. was on the fourth floor of a building near the Palais des Naies. There was a woman from the legal department whose name I didn't catch, and a man from personnel who kept his eyes on his own documents while I signed mine, which I understood as a form of courtesy. 7 pages, each one correct, each one meaning exactly what it said. I initialed where indicated and signed where indicated and dated each page, September through March, which was the administrative record of 6 months I have no desire to reconstruct in this room right now or any other. I signed the papers and took the copies and went to the airport and flew to Bogota, and then to Cali, and I was home before I'd processed that I was going home. My father met me at arrivals. He didn't ask about the separation. He had a sense for the shape of things, my father. He said, "You look like you need to eat something." We went to a place near his apartment that he'd been going to for 30 years, and I had a soup I hadn't had since I was 12 years old, and I felt, for the first time in what I can only estimate as years, actually hungry. Not maintenance eating, hungry. I ate 2 bowls. He watched me eat without saying anything. That was the right thing to do, and he knew it. When I finished, he asked if I wanted more, and I said no, and he called for the bill and paid it before I could argue, and we walked back to his apartment in the evening, and he made coffee, and we sat on his balcony and looked at the city, and he said, "So," and I said, "So." And that was the whole conversation. I stayed 4 days, and on the 4th day I signed the lease on Calais 5, and he drove me to see it. And he stood in the middle of the largest room with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ceiling and the walls and the light coming through the window, and nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man confirming something he already knew. The clinic is 4 rooms on Cal 5. El Peñón is not a rich neighborhood, but it's not the poorest either. It has the quality of a place that is held together by people who have decided to hold it together, which is not nothing. The autoclave is old. The examination table is new. Pilar makes better coffee than anything I had in 2 years of field postings, and she runs the intake with an efficiency that makes me feel like the less competent one in the room, which is probably accurate. My brother came to visit in April. He's career Army, further in than I ever was, further in than I wanted to be. He looked at the clinic with the expression of someone who has decided not to say what they're thinking, which is its own kind of respect. We had dinner and he asked about Kidal, and I told him some of it. The report. The hold. The order I refused. The career that ended. Not the ridge. Not the tremor. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You know, you were right." I said I didn't know that. He said, "About the order. About refusing it." I said I didn't know if it mattered. Whether holding Asante changed anything, or whether the thing in the ridge had already finished by the time the unit moved and the relocation was irrelevant. Whether the unit would have been in danger or not. Whether any of my decisions touched anything it was doing. He didn't have an answer. We finished dinner. I walked him out and he stood on Cal 5 and looked up and down the street, and then he said, "The clinic is good, Valentina." Just that. Then he left. Most mornings I sit at the desk before Pilar arrives. Coffee from the machine in the back room. The desk. My right hand flat on the surface. Still. It came back for a while after Kidal, after Geneva, through the board process and the first weeks in Cali. Faint. Manageable. My problem. Then sometime in February it stopped. I don't know the exact day. I noticed it was gone the way you notice a sound has stopped, not when it stops, but in the quiet afterward. My hand flat on the desk and no vibration. I don't know what that means. Whether something very large left a residue in my right hand when it used the frequency to attend to a compound in northern Mali, and the residue settled permanently when the process of leaving finally finished. Or whether the tremor left because I left, because the thing that caused it, the weight of doing work that costs more than it pays, is no longer what my life is. I can't separate those two explanations. I've tried. I know that on September 14th at 14,047, I clocked something behind a man's eyes in northern Mali. I know at 16:15 I stood at a north wall and felt something the size of geography attend to a compound. I know I refused a direct order and invoked a protocol and lost my career, and don't know if any of it mattered to the thing I was trying to stop. I know my hands are steady. That's the shape of it. You asked about Kidal. That's what happened in Kidal.